My father's voice cracked through the wedding microphone like he'd rehearsed it. To my daughter, the success of this family. Then he turned, found me at the back table, and added, and to my other daughter. Well, we love her anyway. The room laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a comfortable one. The kind of laugh that comes from people who've heard this joke before and know exactly where to put their forks down so they can clap along. I was 31 years old, wearing a navy dress I'd bought because it didn't draw attention, and I sat there smiling with a champagne flute in my hand while 200 people toasted my failure as a punchline at my own sister's wedding. My name is Renee Calloway. I grew up in Lansing, Michigan, the older daughter in a family that decided early which one of us was going to matter. My sister Brooke was homecoming queen, then a regional sales director, then, as of 4 hours ago, Mrs. Brooke Whitfield, married into the Whitfield family of Whitfield Capital Partners, a private equity firm out of Chicago with offices in 3 states and a reputation for closing deals quietly. I was the daughter who dropped out of a marketing program at 22, moved to Atlanta with $1,100 and a laptop, and didn't come home for Thanksgiving for 3 years because every conversation turned into an inventory of what I hadn't accomplished yet. My mother called it finding herself. My father called it wasting herself. Neither of them ever asked what I actually did for a living, because somewhere around year 2, they'd stopped expecting an answer worth hearing. What they didn't know, what I'd stopped trying to tell them, was that I'd spent the last 6 years building a quiet, specific kind of career. I did forensic financial analysis for mid-size firms, the kind of work nobody puts on a LinkedIn banner because half of it is confidential before it's even finished. I traced money. I found the places where numbers didn't add up, and the people who'd built careers, making sure nobody looked too closely. As of that morning, I was a senior director at Halbrook Meridian, a firm most people in that wedding tent had never heard of, reporting directly to a CEO named Anthony Reyes, who had 4 months earlier told me in his office on the 31st floor, "You're the best read I've got in this building, and I don't say that to people twice." None of that made it into my father's toast. I'd stayed quiet through it. That was the first rule I'd learned a long time ago. When people want to perform your inferiority for an audience, you don't argue with the script. You let them finish. I clapped when everyone else clapped. My mother caught my eye from 2 tables over and gave me the look she always gave me at family events. The one that said, "Don't make this about you," as if I'd been the one holding the microphone. I went and found my sister near the dessert table an hour later. She looked beautiful, genuinely happy, the kind of happy that made it hard to stay angry at her specifically. Brooke had never been cruel to me. She'd just never once corrected anyone who was. "Thank you for coming," she said and meant it. "Wouldn't miss it," I said and meant that too. It was her new mother-in-law, Diane Whitfield, who gave me the first real disturbance of the night. Diane found me by the bar, looked me over in a way that wasn't subtle, and said, "Brooke tells us you're between things right now. That must be hard. Watching your sister land somewhere like this." I told her I worked in finance. She smiled like I'd told a joke. "Of course," she said. "We all have to start somewhere." I let it go. I was good at letting things go. But something in the way she said start somewhere, like she already had a file on me, like the family narrative had been preloaded into her before I'd even walked in, sat wrong in my stomach the rest of the night. It got worse 2 days later when I was back in Atlanta, going through the wedding photos Brooke had texted me, and I saw one I almost scrolled past. Diane Whitfield, mid-laugh, standing next to her son Marcus near the gift table, and behind them, half cropped out of frame, a banner for the wedding's corporate sponsor. Oh, it's sure. Whitfield Capital had apparently helped underwrite part of the venue in exchange for some kind of promotional tie-in with a company called Castellan Logistics Group. I knew that name. I knew it because 3 weeks earlier, on the 31st floor of Halbrook Meridian, I had pulled the first thread of an internal audit flagging irregular wire activity tied to a logistics holding company under that exact name, a shell structure routing payments through accounts that didn't match the invoices behind them. It was supposed to be confidential. It was supposed to have nothing to do with my family. I sat there at my kitchen table at 9:14 p.m., phone in my hand, feeling my pulse pick up in a way I hadn't felt since the day Anthony Reyes first handed me that file and said, "I need you to be quiet about this until I tell you otherwise." My stomach dropped. Because if Castellan Logistics was connected to Whitfield Capital, connected to the family that had just spent an entire wedding calling me the failure, then the thing I'd been quietly building toward at work was about to walk straight back through my front door, wearing a wedding ring and a borrowed last name. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't text Brooke. I closed my laptop, sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, and made a decision I'd learned the hard way over 6 years of this work. When something this big surfaces, you don't react. You document. You build the file before you ever say a word out loud. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to find out by asking questions at the next family dinner. I was going to find out the way I always did, quietly, patiently, on my own terms. And for the first time since that toast, I wasn't thinking about being called a failure. I was thinking about how long it had been since anyone in my family had any idea what I was actually capable of. The first thing I did was nothing. That sounds wrong for someone who just connected her sister's new in laws to a federal adjacent audit, but doing nothing on purpose was the entire skill. I'd learned that lesson from Anthony Reyes himself, back when I was 2 years into the job and wanted to charge into a meeting with half a theory and no proof. He'd looked at me over his glasses and said, "The case you bring me on day one is not the case that survives discovery. Slow down. Build it twice before you say it once." I'd never forgotten that. So on Monday morning, I didn't mention Diane Whitfield, or the wedding banner, or Castellan Logistics to anyone. I went into the office at 8:40 a.m. like always, got my coffee from the place on the ground floor, and sat down at my desk on the 31st floor like I hadn't spent the entire weekend running the same 5 photographs through my head. The Castellan file had come to me through Halbrook Meridian's internal compliance team 6 weeks earlier. It started as a routine audit request from a mid-tier client, a logistics holding company looking to refinance, and it had turned into something else the moment I noticed the same $340,000 wire appearing twice in 2 different quarters, once labeled as equipment leasing and once as consulting services rendered. Same amount, same destination account, different paperwork. That's the kind of detail that means nothing to most people and everything to me. I pulled the original file again that Monday, told myself I was just refreshing my memory, and started cross-referencing the ownership structure behind Castellan Logistics. It took me 40 minutes to find what I was looking for and another 2 hours to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. Castellan Logistics Group was 38% owned by a holding entity called Brenfield Partners, LLC. Brenfield Partners, LLC's registered agent, according to the Illinois Secretary of State filing, was a woman named Diane R. Whitfield. My stomach didn't drop this time. It went cold, slow, all the way down. I sat back in my chair and looked at my closed office door for a long minute. Then I did the only thing that made sense. I started a second file. Not the official compliance file, the one that already existed in Hallbrook's system. A personal one. A timeline. Dates, screenshots, names, account numbers I was allowed to see in my role, cross-referenced against the wedding photo metadata, against Brooke's own Instagram posts about Marcus's family business, against a LinkedIn page for Marcus Whitfield that listed him as Director of Strategic Partnerships, Castellan Logistics Group, since March of the previous year. I didn't tell Brooke. I didn't tell my parents. I especially didn't tell Anthony, not yet, because the second I told him I had a personal connection to this case, I'd be pulled off it. Conflict of interest, mandatory disclosure, the whole protocol. And I wasn't ready to be pulled off it. Not until I understood what I was actually looking at. For the next 3 weeks, I built that file the way I'd build any others, methodically, after hours, never on company time, never using anything I wasn't already cleared to access. I cross-checked invoice dates against Brooke and Marcus's relationship timeline, which I reconstructed mostly from old Facebook posts and one extremely useful baby shower photo where Marcus was tagged at a Brenfield Partners holiday dinner, 18 months before the wedding. I made a spreadsheet. I labeled columns. I felt for the first time in years completely in control of a story that involved my family. My mother called twice during those 3 weeks. Once to ask if I was coming to Easter, once to mention, almost as an aside, that Brooke and Marcus were doing so well, you should see their new place in Lincoln Park. 4 bedrooms, can you imagine? I said that was wonderful. I did not say that I just traced 11 separate wire transfers between Brenfield Partners and three other shell entities, all flowing eventually into a personal account that, according to property records, had been used as the down payment on that exact four-bedroom place in Lincoln Park. The bigger reveal came on a Thursday at 2:17 p.m. when I was cross-referencing Castellan's consulting services line items against actual vendor contracts in the compliance database. That's when I found the second name. Not Diane, not Marcus. My father. A line item from 14 months earlier, $22,000, labeled Regional Logistics Consulting, paid out of a Brenfield controlled account to an entity called Callaway Advisory Group. I knew that name too. I'd seen it once on a tax document my father had asked me to just glance at 2 years ago when I'd made the mistake of mentioning I understood finance better than he gave me credit for. Callaway Advisory Group was my father's failed consulting business, the one that shut down in 18 months, the one he never talked about, the one that left him needing a loan from somewhere that, until that Thursday afternoon, I had never once thought to ask about. I put my pen down. I sat very still in my office with the door closed, my hands flat on the desk like I needed to physically hold myself in place. My father, the man who'd stood up at a wedding and called me the failure of the family, had taken $22,000 from the same shell network I'd been quietly investigating for 6 weeks. Whether he knew what it was or not, whether he was a small piece of something larger or just a man who'd needed money and asked the wrong people, I didn't know yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sitting there at 2:17 on a Thursday afternoon with my pulse loud in my own ears. This wasn't just about Brooke's in-laws anymore. This was about my own family, sitting closer to the center of this than any of them could possibly imagine. And they had no idea that the daughter they'd spent a wedding calling a failure was the only person in either family who actually understood what they'd walked into. I picked the pen back up. I kept building. I gave myself one more week before I told Anthony anything. I needed to know how deep this went, and I needed to know it without anyone, Brooke, my parents, Diane Whitfield, or Anthony Reyes, finding out I was looking. The thread that finally broke the case open wasn't financial. It was a smart speaker. Brooke had sent me a video 2 weeks after the wedding, unprompted. The kind of thing she did when she wanted me to feel included. A clip of Marcus's family's living room, decorated for a welcome home dinner after the honeymoon, Diane Whitfield laughing in the background. I almost didn't watch past the first 10 seconds, but on the second watch, I noticed the home assistant device on the kitchen counter behind them. The little light ring glowing blue, clearly mid-recording from someone asking it to play music. It was a stretch, and I knew it was a stretch. But 6 years in forensic finance teaches you that people who think they're being recorded for a wedding video forget that other systems are listening too. Security cameras, smart speakers, shared cloud storage. 3 days later, almost as a long shot, I asked Brooke, casually, in a normal sisterly text, whether the Whitfields used a shared family cloud account for photos since I wanted to find a good wedding picture to frame. She said yes, and that Diane basically runs the whole family's tech, and laughed about how Diane had access to everyone's calendars, even Marcus's work stuff. She's old school like that. That was the second piece. Diane wasn't just a registered agent on paper, she was operationally inside her son's business calendar. I didn't ask Brooke for access. I would never have asked her to compromise herself. And I didn't need to. What I needed was already sitting in front of me in the compliance file. An internal Castellan email, forwarded as part of the original audit request that I'd skimmed past weeks earlier without thinking much of it. I went back and read it properly. It was a calendar invite, forwarded by accident in a chain, titled Deed Abattu/MW, Friday Financing Check-in. Time-stamped 2 days before that 14-month-old $22,000 payment to my father's old company. Diane Whitfield wasn't a passive in-law collecting a dividend. She was scheduling the financing. I finally called Anthony on a Tuesday morning, 9:02 a.m., before either of us had a single meeting on the calendar. I told him everything: the wedding, the toast, Diane, Marcus, Brenfield Partners, and the line that connected straight back to my own father. I expected him to pull me off the case immediately. Instead, he sat quiet for a moment, the way he does when he's deciding something, and said, "I'm not removing you. I'm bringing in outside counsel, and you're going to tell them everything you just told me in writing today." That afternoon, I met Patricia Anselm, an attorney Holbrook Meridian used for exactly this kind of situation: civil fraud, regulatory exposure, the cases where the line between bad business and actual crime hadn't been drawn yet. Patricia had a reputation in 3 states for one specific thing: she did not lose, and she did not let her clients settle just because settling was easier. She read my personal timeline front to back without saying a word, then looked up and said, "You built this clean." That's rare. Most people panic and contaminate their own evidence. She told me the case was bigger than I'd guessed, that Holbrook's compliance team had already flagged Brenfield Partners to a federal contact 8 months earlier, before I'd ever touched the file, because of a pattern of structured payments designed to stay just under reporting thresholds. My father's $22,000 wasn't an isolated favor. It was one of at least 19 similar consulting payments to small, struggling businesses owned by people connected to the Whitfield family's wider social circle, each one just large enough to matter to the person receiving it, just small enough to disappear into Castellan's books. "They weren't paying your father for advice," Patricia said. "They were paying him to be quiet and to keep being grateful." I sat with that for a long moment. My father, who'd stood up at that wedding and called me a failure in front of 200 people, had been quietly kept on a leash by the very family he was now bragging about marrying into. "There's something else, it's not," Patricia added, sliding a printed page across the table. "Castellan tried to get ahead of this 2 months ago. Internal memo. They offered the federal contacts office an early settlement, structured to avoid a public filing." She tapped the page. "It was rejected. Whoever's running this wants it in the open." That was the bigger reveal landing on top of the first one. This wasn't a quiet shell game anyone could just write a check to fix. Someone with real authority had already decided this case was going public, with or without my family's permission, with or without my sister's marriage surviving it. I drove back to my apartment that night, replaying my father's voice from the wedding. To my other daughter, "Well, we love her anyway." I thought about Diane Whitfield at the bar. We all have to start somewhere. They had spent years deciding I was the one who didn't matter, the one whose life needed no real attention. And the entire time, I'd been the only person in either family who could read the documents that were about to end the life Brooke had just married into. I texted Patricia that night with one line: "I want to be there when it comes out, not hiding from it." She texted back almost immediately: "I was hoping you'd say that. Let's plan it right." I closed my phone, looked at my reflection in the dark window, and felt something settle in my chest that hadn't been there in years. I wasn't passive. I was building. And for the first time, I knew exactly where this was going to end. Patricia Anselm didn't believe in confrontations that happened by accident. "If this comes out messy," she told me at our second meeting, "the story becomes about the mess. We need it to come out clean, on a timeline we control, in a room where the facts can't be argued with." The problem was timing. The Federal Contacts Office, a financial crimes unit attached to the Northern District, was moving on its own schedule, and Patricia couldn't force their hand. What she could do was make sure that whenever it broke, I wasn't standing outside the story looking in. She filed a formal notice on my behalf, establishing that I'd identified and reported the connection independently before any personal conflict existed on paper. It was a small, precise legal move. It meant that no one, not my father, not Diane Whitfield, not some defense attorney 3 months from now, could claim I'd buried a conflict of interest to protect myself. "This protects you," Patricia said. "It also means when this comes out, you come out looking exactly like what you are, the person who found it." While Patricia worked the legal timeline, Anthony Reyes worked a different angle. Holbrook Meridian had a relationship with a financial journalist named Carla Voss, who'd covered 2 prior structured payment cases for a regional business paper and had a track record of waiting for documentation instead of running on leaks. Anthony didn't hand her anything. He simply mentioned, over a call I sat in on, that If a federal filing happens involving Castellan Logistics and Brenfield Partners,
Uh-huh.
Hallbrook would have no comment beyond confirming the audit history, which told Carla everything she needed to know about where to be looking in a few weeks. I still hadn't said a word to my family. That changed on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after meeting Patricia, when my mother called to invite me to a family dinner at my parents' house, the kind of dinner that I would learn later Diane Whitfield had specifically requested, because Brooke and Marcus were announcing they were buying into a stake of Brenfield Partners themselves, a wedding gift from Diane disguised as an investment opportunity. I almost didn't go. Patricia told me I should. If they're doing this now, she said, they're moving faster than we expected. You need to be in that room. I sat at my parents' dining table that night and watched my father pour wine for Marcus like he was pouring it for royalty. Diane wasn't there, but her presence ran through every sentence Marcus said. My mother thinks, my mother set this up. My mother's always been ahead of the curve on this stuff. Brooke looked happy. My mother looked proud. My father looked, for the first time in my whole life, slightly nervous, glancing at me twice in a way he never used to bother doing. He knew something. He just didn't know how much I knew. Marcus stood up near the end of dinner, glass in hand, and made a small toast about expanding the family's footprint, about how Brenfield was about to be bigger than anyone outside the family understood, about timing being everything in business. My father laughed too loud at that line. I understood, watching him, that whatever he'd taken that $22,000 for, he was still hoping there'd be more where that came from. I didn't say anything that night. I drove home, called Patricia at 9:40 p.m., and told her what I'd heard. They're escalating their own exposure, she said. Good, that's not a problem. That's a gift. The federal filing came 11 days later. Not the day of a wedding, not at a dinner, but on an ordinary Wednesday morning. The way these things actually happen. Halbrook Meridian's compliance file became part of the public record in a civil fraud action against Brenfield Partners, LLC, and 3 affiliated entities, naming Diane R. Whitfield as a controlling party and Castellan Logistics Group as the operating vehicle for a structured payment scheme involving at least 23 separate transactions designed to avoid federal reporting thresholds. Carla Voss's article ran that same afternoon, citing an internal Halbrook Meridian audit and a source close to the investigation who first identified the financial pattern. My father's name wasn't in the article, not yet, but the filing itself, attached as a public exhibit, listed every payee in the Brenfield network, and Callaway Advisory Group was there. Line 19 of 23, $22,000, dated 14 months earlier. Brooke called me 40 minutes after the article went up. She didn't yell. She just asked very quietly, "Did you know about this?" I told her the truth. I found it after the wedding. I've spent 2 months building the file that just became public. There was a long silence on the line. Why didn't you tell me? She finally asked. Because telling you before it was solid would have meant choosing you over the truth, I said. And I needed you to have a chance to choose for yourself once it was real. She hung up. I let her. The confrontation I'd been bracing for didn't happen on a phone call, though. It happened 4 days later at a press conference Patricia had arranged with the federal prosecutor's office, one where Halbrook Meridian, at Anthony's insistence, allowed me to be named publicly as the analyst whose internal audit had triggered the case. Diane Whitfield, through her own attorney, tried one last move that week, an offer to settle quietly with Halbrook's client and avoid further filings. Patricia's answer, relayed to me in one short text, was 4 words. We said no. Again. My parents watched the press conference from their living room. I know because my mother texted me halfway through it. One line, no punctuation. Nothing like the woman who'd told me not to make my own sister's wedding about myself. I didn't know who you'd become. I read it twice, standing in a hallway outside the conference room, still wearing the same calm expression I'd worn for 2 months while I built a case nobody else knew I was building. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to feel something simple. Anger, maybe, or vindication. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Steadier. For the first time since that wedding toast, I wasn't the daughter they'd talked over. I was the only person in either family who'd actually told the truth. The investigation into Brentfield Partners moved faster once it was public. That's how these cases work. Once the filing exists, once a reporter has it, once the prosecutor's office is committed to a position in front of cameras, the structure starts collapsing from the inside because everyone connected to it suddenly needs their own lawyer, and lawyers don't protect each other for free. Diane Whitfield's attorney withdrew the settlement offer entirely within a week. Not because Diane wanted to fight, Patricia told me, but because two of the smaller consulting recipients, people in the same position my father had been in, people who'd taken $20,000 or $30,000 at a moment they needed it, had been subpoenaed for depositions and started talking. One of them, a man who'd run a failed catering business in Joliet, told investigators almost exactly what Patricia had already told me weeks earlier. The payments weren't consulting fees. They were leverage, a way of keeping people grateful and quiet, and unlikely to ask questions about where the real money in the family was actually going. My father was never charged. The federal investigators determined what Patricia had suspected from the start, that he was a recipient, not an architect, a man who'd taken money he needed without asking enough questions about where it came from. But not charged isn't the same as untouched. His name appeared in two follow-up articles. People in Lansing who'd watched him give that wedding toast 8 months earlier now knew exactly what kind of family he'd been so eager to marry his daughter into. Marcus filed for divorce from Brooke 11 weeks after the press conference. I don't know everything that happened in that marriage, and I never asked Brooke for details she didn't offer. What I do know is that Brooke called me on a Tuesday night, almost a year to the day after her wedding, and said 4 words I'd been waiting 2 months to hear. "You were right to wait." We didn't talk about the wedding toast. We didn't need to. She asked instead what I actually did for a living. Really asked? The way you ask a stranger you're meeting for the first time, with actual curiosity instead of an assumption already sitting behind the question. I told her about Holbrook Meridian, about Anthony, about the kind of work I'd been quietly building a career in for 6 years while my family decided I hadn't built anything at all. "I had no idea," she said. "I know," I said. That was kind of the point for a while. My mother and I have spoken twice since that first text. Both conversations were short, careful, the kind two people have when they're not sure yet what the relationship is allowed to become. My father hasn't called at all. Patricia tells me that's common in cases like this. The people who built their self-image on being right rarely call the person who proved them wrong, even when that person never wanted to be right about something this painful. Holbrook Meridian promoted me 4 months after the filing. Anthony made the announcement himself in a meeting I wasn't expecting to be more than routine, standing in front of the executive floor and saying my name the way my father never had, not as a punchline, not as an afterthought, but as the answer to a question everyone in that room had apparently already been asking. Renee identified a pattern that the federal government is now treating as one of the larger structured payment cases this office has seen in 5 years, he said. She did it quietly, methodically, and without cutting a single corner. That's the kind of analyst this firm is built around. I thought about the wedding tent, the navy dress. My father's voice cracking through a microphone, calling me the one who never amounted to anything, while 200 people laughed along. I didn't say any of that out loud in the meeting. I just said thank you the way you do, and went back to my desk and let the quiet settle over me the way it always had. Not the quiet of someone waiting to be noticed, but the quiet of someone who'd never actually needed to be. I still see Brooke. We're rebuilding something slower and more honest than what we had before, something that doesn't depend on either of us performing a role at a dinner table. I haven't decided yet what I want my relationship with my parents to look like. Patricia says that's allowed to take time. Anthony says some of the best work he's ever seen has come from people who learned, the hard way, exactly how much they could carry alone. I think about that toast sometimes, not with anger anymore, just with a kind of distance. The way you look back at a version of a room you don't live in anymore. My father stood up that night and told 200 people I was the failure of the family. He just happened to be wrong in front of all of them, 8 months too early to know it.